Let's face it, two-way radio is an intimidating subject, and many of the videos, websites, and guides out there are more enthusiastic than they are helpful. The truth is that short-range radio really isn't that complicated. Using a radio is as simple as keying the mic and speaking into it. Anybody who can program a VCR, hook up a TV, or use Microsoft Excel can hack anything up to a ham technician's license, generally just by winging it. The hang-ups come when scads of technical details are thrown at the viewer. This video will serve as a very basic and brief introduction to what two-way radio has to offer preppers, the average citizen who's interested in alternative communications, and of course neighborhood defenders. The material has been adapted from my short book, Basic SHTF Radio, which is available on Amazon. My advice here is intended to answer many of the questions of those of you who have no experience with two-way radio. And if you're not aware of who I am, I'm a post-apocalyptic author and veteran of the Ventura County, California Sheriff's Office. I'm not an expert nor anything special. I would consider myself nothing more than a knowledgeable novice at ham radio, but I have picked up a few basics that I feel I can share with you. This is not going to be a guide on how to use a particular piece of equipment, a primer for getting a ham radio license, or a detailed explanation of physics. Hopefully, after this video, you will come away with a better understanding of what the realistic capabilities are for an average person who just needs a secondary means of communication. All of the radio types and bands we will cover are in a roughly 2 to 30 mile range. Depending on terrain, that may be shorter or greater with the right equipment or conditions. In a relatively flat, open suburban or rural area, 5 to 10 miles for a vehicle-mounted radio is realistic, or 1 to 5 miles for a handheld portable radio. Now I can do a later video where I explain my experiences using vehicle and handheld VHF radios with the Sheriff's Department, which probably actually would be very helpful, but I'm going to keep that out for right now. Just keep in mind, this is short-range communication. This is not going to be long-distance, short-wave things or the various options that can supplant but not replace a cell phone. If you want to get into that, you really need to dig deep, and you're probably not going to be starting with this video if that's the case. So while some basic radio and electromagnetism science and theory will be discussed, this video is going to focus on practical matters. So I'll start with what your options are before getting into the technical bits. So if there's something you don't understand, I'll circle back to it. Unlicensed and minimally licensed radio. Radio frequencies within a certain range are set aside for different purposes and groups. These are called bands. While they have definite frequencies allocated, it's easier to refer to the different bands by their purpose, such as CB radio, or by the wavelength, such as 70 centimeter, which is a ham UHF band. In the unlicensed and minimally licensed radio category, you have GMRS, FRS, MURS, and CB. It's important to note that while GMRS, FRS, and MURS frequencies can be transmitted on by a Baofeng ham radio, it's technically illegal to do so, although nobody's going to mind when the world ends. GMRS stands for General Mobile Radio Service. They're intended for family communications. They're popular with off-roaders and often used without a license illegally by anyone needing a short-range radio. And there really is no prosecution for using GMRS without a license. But to be a good boy, the license is $35, requires no tests, and the online application is approved in 1 to 2 days. The license is good for 10 years, and practically any close relative can use your license. GMRS is a poor man's UHF ham analog, but lots of people are using a few channels, so you have fewer options than with ham radio. Portable radios are usually 5 watts, which would give you about 1 to 3 miles range in town without connecting to a rooftop antenna. 50-watt units, usually in vehicles or at home, and an external antenna can cover up to 15 miles depending on the terrain. If the cell network is down, my suggestion is to put a mobile GMRS 50-watt mobile radio in each vehicle, and then a 50-watt base station radio at home, with an antenna on the roof, of course. If each car in the family has a radio with a suitable antenna mounted on the roof, talking to a 50-watt station at home with a rooftop antenna would be a breeze across a lot of suburban-type cities. I have buddies that talk over 15 miles easily using these radios, the 50 watts, in a large urban bowl-shaped area. It's a valley of some sort. Each family member could also have a portable radio, aka a walkie-talkie with them. These can also be heard at longer distances depending on the terrain. And if you have a better antenna, you can receive better, you can transmit better. But if you're on the walkie-talkie, you may be at the disadvantage. It just really depends on terrain, what you can hear and what not, so she get out there and practice. Now, there are 22 frequencies on GMRS, with 7 of them being allocated for repeater use. These frequencies are shared with FRS, and both services can communicate with each other legally. Open or public GMRS repeaters are operated by clubs and enthusiasts in many places. Repeater frequencies are noted as essentially a second channel with a suffix of R, i.e. 22R or 22 Romeo. However, GMRS repeaters are less common than those on the licensed amateur bands. GMRS is second to having a ham technician's license, and its capabilities are very similar to the 70 centimeter ham UHF radio. They're in the same part of the spectrum, so the characteristics are very similar. But again, you don't have as many options on what frequencies you can talk on, and the repeaters are less. Now, the key to making the most out of GMRS is getting good quality radios. Like ham radios, GMRS radios have the option to be upgraded. So my family and my defensive preparedness group use Woshun KG805G portable radios using the downloadable software and a custom band plan within the GMRS frequency range. We have our own setup programmed. All that really is basically repeaters that we want to use, because you're still working with the same basic bed of channels. Now, I say we, but I replaced all the short rubber ducking antennas with either a 19-inch Nagoya whip antenna or, in my case, a flexible folding antenna, which is the most important part of getting better range and reception. You really do need a longer antenna. Now, the sister to GMRS, the younger sister, is FRS, the Family Radio Service. This does not require a license, and they share the same UHF frequencies with GMRS, all 22 channels minus the repeaters. They can legally talk to each other, which is great because you can give your kids cheap FRS radios while the grown-ups can still use their GMRS radios, and everybody can stay in touch. That is, as long as no one wanders too far apart. Remember, these FRS radios are more limited in wattage or transmitting power than your GMRS units. These are the blister pack radios from the store. So whereas GMRS will let you talk across town, FRS is good within the immediate neighborhood, like taking them to Disneyland. Now, these antennas, unlike GMRS, like we just discussed, they're not intended to be replaced. The channels can't be reprogrammed on the radio to have a different name or to get the repeaters. It's 1 through 22. Now, an unexpected advantage of the FRS radios is their ubiquity. Because they're cheap blister pack radios, you and your neighbor probably have some of them at home already. They're in stores all over the place. This means that unprepared people might suddenly discover they have a communications capability they didn't even know about. The low price point enables you to buy a whole bunch to pack away. Buy it cheap, stack it deep, and you can pass them out in contingencies. So you can give it to the neighborhood watch, give it to the neighbors to stay in touch, and they can talk back to you while you're using your GMRS radio. MURS is the multi-use radio service. It's basically the VHF version of CB radio. No license is required, and it is less capable than GMRS. You can use MURS for personal and business use with no problems, but power is limited to 2 watts. There are only 5 frequencies versus 22 for GMRS or FRS. Range in most urban conditions is probably going to be about a mile at best. I personally wouldn't use MURS because it's just so limited. You can do so much more with GMRS. Now, CB radio, or Citizens Band, is the old American communication standby for truckers and the Brady Bunch alike. It has largely fallen out of popularity. Who do you know that uses CB radios? I mean, literally, it's truckers and off-roaders. It's at the fuzzy border between high frequency, which is the shortwave, and VHF FM radio, which kind of gives CB the greatest range of all the options in this category. It can work well in hilly terrain due to the nature of the radio waves for its portion of the spectrum. Maximum legal wattage for CB is 4 watts, which won't reach far, but if you buy illegal amplifiers, you can increase your power dramatically to reach across whole counties, depending on the terrain, of course. Under the right conditions, with the right equipment, a CB radio base station could reach out to around 30 miles or so, which would give you medium-range communications without a repeater. I haven't heard of anyone getting in trouble for using illegal amplifiers, and it's really been a common practice since at least the 70s. You can look up stories, and you find somebody who's into the CB hobby, and they'll tell you stories about atmospheric skip and talking to someone, in Georgia when they're in, Boston or something ridiculous like that. But of course, the same characteristics that give you this advantage in range also can work against you because it's a little bit more susceptible to interference and atmospheric tricks. So for medium range communications, this is probably as close as you're going to get without having to go to the ham side and really learning high frequency radio, which is more complicated. I personally wouldn't use CB as a primary vehicle radio because we have better options now, but the ubiquity of CB and the 40 channels on it do make it a useful tool and a good secondary vehicle radio. There are a lot of these things still out there, and people, do use it for cars and such. So it's an adjunct. A CB radio base station with a good antenna mounted on the roof with a powerful amplifier would be a great base station radio. So you could talk two houses could talk to each other, perhaps across the county. Terrain doesn't become such an issue then. Just note that the range is, again, going to be highly variable in the real world. It's going to be dependent on your equipment, but 20 miles is not outside the realm of possibility with CB radio. And now we get to licensed radio, or the amateur radio service, which is called ham radio. And if you're wondering why it's called ham radio, it's because someone who's new at something, kind of a novice or a rookie, we call them hams. I mean, something that's not done very well is ham-handed, right? Anyhow, ham radio is properly known, again, as the amateur radio service. It is licensed by the FCC. If you want greater flexibility and the benefits of better radios and frequency choices than the unlicensed options, pursue your license. Ham radio is a big world. It covers many different bands and a huge variety of capabilities from short and medium range to truly worldwide reach. The options that we'll cover here are the basic ones that just about anyone can access. For most people, being able to talk short range is enough. However, the ham radio hobby can take you to a lot of very interesting places with capabilities you might not even think possible. I mean, there's slow scan TV. You can send email through ham radio. You can text images based on sound, like a fax machine. It's pretty interesting, but we're going to keep it basic because those are much more technical and much more involved than the average person wants to get involved with. To obtain your amateur operator license, you need to pass the test and pay a $35 application fee. Morse code is not required any longer. The tests are put on by many ham radio organizations around the country on a regular basis. There's one near you wherever you live. If you want to just get the license, studying the test is enough to pass. The question pool is public domain. There's many test preparation websites you can take practice tests on. The big secret that a lot of guys very much into ham and tend to be more traditional types, sort of the big nerds, they don't want you to know that you don't need to know a lot of the electrical stuff that they take pleasure in and enjoy. You can just cram the tests. And I point that out because there's too many people put off by some misunderstanding that you need to be an electronics whiz to pass it. No. And again, for a lot of the things that we want to do, you just want to talk on the radio. You don't need to make your own antenna or a bunch of fancy stuff. It's not a hobby, it's a tool for you. So that being said, I can't recommend enough that in addition to memorizing the answers, you do learn something. You should at least read an introductory ham radio book or study guide. I mean, learn just a very basic, brief overview on how radio waves work. You don't have to learn it to where you could explain it to somebody else, but just have an idea of what's going on when something happens. Personally, I started with ham radios for dummy, and I researched any test questions that I didn't understand or seemed interesting to learn more. Now, the amateur service is divided into 3 license grades: technician, general, and amateur extra. Technician is the easiest level to achieve and gives you access to VHF and UHF bands. If you just want to talk legally on your Baofeng, technician is the way to go. The main advantage of ham over using GMRS is that you have more power, more features in the radio, additional bands, more frequencies, and a better ability to attach peripherals like microphones, antennas, and accessories. So why get a ham license? Yeah, I know that during SHTF, many of you are just going to transmit without a license. I partially agree, and I have a license. I personally don't want to be broadcasting my call sign for the bad guys to generate signals intelligence, aka SIGINT. But you can always just stop using your call sign or make one up if it's that bad. Now, obtaining a ham license in the interim is a positive because it allows you to practice legally now. It allows you to legally use your radio in situations that are less than without the rule of law. Repeater availability for hams is far greater than for GMRS. Restricting yourself to CB or GMRS or whatever may cause you to limit yourself to those bands and equipment, hindering any switch to other bands later due to a lack of experience or complacency. If you're just using a simple GMRS radio, you may never have learned how to use the ham radio that you bought. And finally, if the FCC does engage in targeted prosecutions of unlicensed operators, you won't get in trouble. There's always the possibility that in a state of semi-collapse or anarcho-tyranny where the government is still capable of law enforcement, that you will still need to play by the rules. As of third quarter 2022, we're in the early stages of this sort of gray zone of an anarcho-tyrannical collapse. There may be many instances where 2020-like riots erupt and you need to communicate with other hams. Barring a Mayday-type emergency call, you're going to need a license because otherwise they will not speak to you and they will not let you use their repeaters. Some of these guys will literally call the FCC on you and hunt you down to find your house to bitch you out for using a ham radio without a license. And with how easy they actually are to get, if you're willing to take the time, just get a license. Now, if you don't want to get a license, there's always those unlicensed options that we just covered, but be aware that in a major emergency or a telecom system outage or the grid goes down, the frequencies are going to be clogged with traffic from other unlicensed users. Ham radio gives you more frequencies, greater capabilities, and a more professional radio experience. The radio spectrum is separated into different divisions based on the properties of the radio waves within that division. These divisions are known as bands. Everyone is familiar with different broadcast radio bands, AM, FM, and shortwave. AM radio and shortwave are both in the HF or high frequency range. Despite being at the low end of the spectrum, when radio was brand new, this was the high end of the spectrum of radio waves. FM is even higher in the VHF or very high frequency range. You'll notice a theme. Without worrying about the differences in the signal modulation, you can see that what we're talking about are frequency ranges. And it goes all the way up to extremely high frequency. AM shortwave radio, as you know, they can be very scratchy and low fidelity. At night, they're susceptible to atmospheric fading and interference. I mean, how often have you been listening to an AM talk radio station and it turned to static because you went under a bridge or something? All of this is because AM radio waves have a much longer physical wavelength than FM radio. This can be an advantage, but it also has drawbacks. Wavelengths are measured in meters, which is where names like 2 meters for the most popular ham VHF band comes from. Frequency is measured in hertz or cycles per second. Though an Elmer somewhere screaming right now at my gross oversimplifications, think of wavelength as the description of a region and frequency as the address. A wavelength is the distance between the peaks of a set of waves. In the case of ocean waves, it's from crest to crest. Now, since the energy driving ocean waves and how radio waves and any other type of energy wave works are all the same, if they were all represented in some ideal form, the measurement would be the same thing. From peak to peak equals the wavelength. Now, as the frequency in the dial goes up, the wavelength gets smaller and the properties of radio waves changes. For instance, lower frequencies tend to be less prone to obstructions like terrain. High-frequency radio waves will bounce and skip between the Earth and the atmosphere, which is what gives them their worldwide range. For example, under the right conditions, a 50,000-watt clear-channel AM radio station can be heard hundreds of miles across the country at night. HF ranges from AM shortwave radio to the CB radio range. A similar analog to CB radio is 10-meter amateur band. They're both right on the bleeding edge of high frequency in VHF and are considered near FM radio, Except for limited frequency ranges, at least a general amateur license is required to use HF bands. Technicians have very limited privileges. If you want to talk hundreds of thousands of miles away, it's done in the HF part of the spectrum. However, doing it successfully requires a lot of knowledge about the radios and the antennas, and it's not something that you're just going to easily get yourself into with minimum effort. What anybody can do with high-frequency radio besides CB is listen. You can get yourself a shortwave receiver that's capable of tuning into amateur or military frequencies. Make sure that it's not just limited to the entertainment and news shortwave radio bands. And then you can listen to amateur radio, military aircraft and even maritime high-frequency traffic. So it's more like a scanner than just a little radio for entertainment purposes. Now, the two major bands you'll most likely be dealing with as a prepared citizen are UHF and VHF. These are for short-range communications, about 5 miles, give or take. UHF stands for high frequency. Usually consumer radios are in the 400 megahertz range, like FRS or GMRS. For hams, this includes the very popular 70 centimeter, aka the 440 megahertz band, and a technician level amateur license is required at minimum to legally use the 70 centimeters. VHF stands for very high frequency, usually in the 30 to 200 megahertz range for civilian radios. This is most common for the 2-meter band, and ham radios like the ever popular Baofeng are called dual band, and they can get both UHF and VHF, the 2-meter and 70 centimeter band, and possibly more if you're willing to jailbreak your radio. Now, the 2-meter band requires at least a technician level amateur license at a minimum. If you want to do VHF unlicensed, that leaves you with MURS. Now, VHF and UHF are both line-of-sight radios. This is going to be the same for using your Baofeng or your GMRS radios. They can't be used to talk over obstacles like mountains. Propagations, or how far the radio waves will go, of both are going to suffer if you're going to have terrain or large building in between users. If you're on top of a high hill, you might be able to talk out to the advertised range of 25 miles if someone is equally as high as you are and you both have good antennas and you're both using high output wattage. You can get higher wattage radios and better antennas, but it's going to come down to physics and how far above the radio horizon that you are. In the city, you can realistically expect about 1 to 2 miles on the ground between walkie-talkies or handy-talkies, and about to 5 miles if you are up in the hills in a car. You're probably going to get greater distance because you're using the more powerful radio, simply since there's more room to have a bigger radio in a car and a longer antenna. When you're at home, again, it's going to be terrain dependent, but with a rooftop antenna and a more powerful transmitter, you can get a lot more range, again, probably 15 miles. Realistically, there's no practical difference between UHF and VHF. UHF radio is better for indoor usage and in urban areas because its radio waves penetrate buildings better, at least for very close distances across floors. For example, businesses or fire departments use them to communicate in large buildings. UHF can be blocked by a city skyline, but if you're in a building or need to talk amongst them, UHF for short distances is at the advantage. UHF waves like to bounce around, and this is what gives them their ability to find a way to an antenna. Manhattanites might prefer UHF or VH over VHF, but it's not magic. VHF tends to be better than UHF outdoors where obstructions are limited, and it has a better ability to penetrate trees and vegetation cover. VHF does have the drawback of not being able to bounce over terrain, but it's still going to work, even though some dead zones may exist. VHF could be better understood as a more rural preferenced band, while UHF is a better urban one, but the differences are really too slight to matter. And I can tell you that from experience, my sheriff's department is VHF and a local PD is UHF. Although a lot of agencies are moving to like the 700 megahertz UHF radio right now, again, because really it doesn't matter that much. So if you need to get your comm situation squared away right freaking now, this is what I suggest. Buy one portable handheld GMRS radio per adult in your family, along with one replacement antenna each. Buy a better antenna than what comes in the box. Buy a programming cable as well. That way you can put repeaters in from your local area. For your younger kids and around the house or property or for emergencies, buy a pack of those FRS radios so that you can all talk together. To use a portable radio in the car, you can take the white trash solution. You can buy an adapter cable and a couple little adapters to attach to a magnetic mount that you throw on the roof. And then you just run the cable through the weather stripping, through a closed door, and screw that into your little handset, and boom, there you go. You don't have to drill a hole or mount a radio or anything like that in your car. Now, if you do want to buy a Baofeng radio, you can buy it now and put it on the shelf. It's not going to hurt anything as long as you're not talking without a license. But definitely pursue your license, get it while you can, and start using it. Also, buy the equipment now. You'll probably want to get a better antenna, programming cable, a shoulder mic, a larger battery pack, those kind of things. As far as what radio you should buy, I'm not going to make much of the way in specific radio recommendations. Find what works from you from a functionality and price standpoint. This is where buy once, cry once does apply, though. Personally, for handheld transceivers, I use Baofeng's and Anytones for VHF, UHF ham traffic, and Wuxun KG805G radios for GMRS. You'll see some of those slides in this video. Now, Baofeng's can access frequency outside their approved bands, which is usually 2 meters to 70 centimeters. Even new radios are supposedly have the ability to do that deactivated. Per the FCC, can be jailbroken to allow it. Now, if you're going to use a Baofeng for GMRS, FRS, remember that it's technically illegal, and the FCC as well as white knight ham operators can tell by signal analysis that you're not using a proper GMRS radio. The FCC is really particular about people using only approved equipment for each service and band. In reality, it's not going to matter. In conclusion, this is a very brief guide to getting started with radio. Again, it's just fresh from my brain to you guys. It's not something that's supposed to be particularly flashy or good, but it's truthful. I think it's helpful, and I hope that I have cut out a lot of the crap to get to the point. Just ease yourself into the technical aspects of radio. Don't worry about having to become an electrical engineer. I mean, if you want to learn more, connect with your local ham club, or consider taking a training course. And if you get into ham, you start reaching out, you can find a lot of people who are very willing to help you. You know, my group, there's somebody who programmed our radios for us. He created the radio plan. They have the advice on what we should be using, what we should be doing. There are a lot of ham people that are not bad. They're not judgmental nerds. They really like the fact that people are getting interested in this hobby and are really willing to help you out. As far as courses and training, you can visit your local ham clubs. They do a lot of stuff. But if you want more formal, hands-on, and contingency-based training, I have to recommend NC Scout, aka Brush Beater. He runs some excellent and well-reviewed courses that cover practical radio operating techniques for contested field environments. Put it that way. If you're looking for a more tactically oriented course in particular, Scout is the man for that. Check out his course descriptions and the training calendar at brushbeater.org. Now, if you like this video and want to support my work, and if you want to learn more about ways to survive civil war, domestic unrest, nuclear war, if you're just looking for some post-apocalyptic